Peace. This is the Enemy's Public. I am Bro.Nasir, coming back to you with part 2 of the FBI hearing on the weaponization of government agencies. I wasn't going to come back, but after listening to some of the testimony of the agents and the witnesses, had to come back and show the rest of this because it's very, very important. So I'm going to get right back to it and share it with the people.
I do not consider parents as domestic terrorists. No, I do not.
No, and neither do the American people. But there's more to this story. It goes back further than that initial letter on September 29th, because the letter didn't happen organically. It was solicited. It was solicited by the White House and by the Secretary of Education. Essentially, the Biden administration laid the predicate for which it used to justify illegally targeting the American people, targeting these parents. Is it proper protocol as a former FBI officer to set that predicate, to manufacture the reasoning to justify opening an investigation?
I believe that no one should be targeted for free speech and that violence should never be tolerated under any circumstance, but it should definitely not, no one should be targeted because they want to speak up at a school board meeting.
This was a setup. And it was the setup, and it's the real definition of weaponization of the government against the American people. And it's not just this example of targeting parents at School Boards Association. It goes back to the opening of Crossfire Hurricane. It goes back to the faulty FISA application. It goes back to what we heard on that first panel from Senators Grassley and Johnson. It goes back to the suppression illegally of the Hunter Biden laptop story paid for by the US taxpayers. This corruption needs to be rooted out, and it's not just about protecting the US Constitution. It is most importantly about protecting the American people from the weaponization of the federal government against them. Yield back.
Lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very interesting. As a parent of 5 children, I think having my rights as a parent is a very sacred trust, a very sacred trust. But Mr. Williams, would you say that having worked as a prosecutor, threats of violence against individuals is something that supersedes an individual simply being a parent?
Of course, Madam Ranking Member, threats of violence are actionable under the law. When they come, prosecutors can investigate, or the FBI or any other investigative agency can investigate them and prosecute as appropriate.
Sure. This one-page DOJ memo that we've made much ado about says in its first instance that the First Amendment protected activity should never be subject to prosecution, and issues a concern to illegal violence and threats of violence that are made to school board officials, most of whom are, surprise, surprise, parents, volunteers who do the unenviable job of trying to direct their children and their communities' activities with regard to education, job most of us, thankfully, have not had to do. And I'm also troubled, I'm deeply troubled by all of the events, as well as the increase in violence and threats of violence against civil servants and federal law enforcement as we attempt to weaponize these individuals doing their job. In fact, we've seen the consequences of this rhetoric over and over again. I'm also deeply troubled by the idea of Congress, as I said in my opening statement, using oversight as a weapon to air a list of political grievances. Seem to hear much of that from the first panel, especially. I've been a member of the House Oversight Committee, where I saw firsthand how good oversight can help Congress make better public policy. Mr. Williams, you've worked in both Congress and the executive branch. Do you agree with me that oversight of the federal government is an important legislative process?
Absolutely. As Representative Raskin said at the first panel, the Constitution doesn't explicitly lay out an oversight mandate, but the legislative mandate of Congress provides Congress with its ability to engage in oversight. Oversight is good when it helps the government work better.
Thank you. Do you agree that congressional oversight is at its best when it's focused on addressing the real problems that Americans face on every day?
The real problems Americans face every day and making government work better. Absolutely, Congresswoman.
I believe in congressional oversight, and committee Democrats would be willing to work together to conduct oversight of matters such as the disproportionate audits by the IRS of African-American families. Recent reports about former Attorney General Bill Barr and Special Counsel John Durham. Mr. Williams, do you agree that congressional oversight works best when it's bipartisan in nature?
Absolutely.
And have you seen examples of that in bipartisan investigations?
Oh,
I know
absolutely.
that it's so infrequent now. But have you ever seen any?
Absolutely. A great example is in 2016 when the House Committee on Oversight, led by Republican Chairman Jason Chaffetz and Ranking Member Elijah Cummings, worked together on an investigation, a bipartisan investigation of the United States Secret Service and mismanagement and misbehavior there. It led to bipartisan legislation that made, as I said, the government work better and Secret Service a more functional organization.
What about cooperation between the branches of government? Is it necessary for Congress to be willing to work with the executive branch in investigations?
Yes, and vice versa. Absolutely. The executive branch should be willing to work with Congress as well.
And would that first instance be trying to come to agreement as to when and how documents and information could be given?
Absolutely. The public sees hearings, but does not see that when the process works properly, there's a back and forth and a give and take between the two parties at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, as I said before.
Would you
Yes,
say
both
2
sides.
weeks into the Congress issuing subpoenas might be a bit premature for the investigation and cooperation between those branches of government?
Certainly, Congressman, Congress has the authority to issue subpoenas quickly if they wish, but I guess you get more flies with honey than with vinegar, to be cute. And working with the other side collaboratively is always going to be a better approach.
Vinegar seems to work better on social media, though, than the honey. I yield back.
I think the gentlelady, I would just point out, we tried the honey. 100 letters we sent in the last Congress. We tried the honey.
The last Congress, you're now the chair.
The honey didn't work.
You're
That's
now
why
in
we
the
sent
majority. You
subpoenas.
should have tried that first as the chair of this committee, not as the ranking member.
We tried. We
You didn't
tried
do
with
that as
100 and some
chairman.
letters.
You didn't.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Wyoming, Ms. Hageman.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan. It is a privilege to serve on this select subcommittee, and I look forward to the work we have ahead of us. After over 30 years as a water, natural resource, and constitutional attorney, I have seen firsthand and fought against the weaponization of the federal government against my fellow Wyoming citizens and the country at large. Through the testimony of our witnesses today and the points made by my colleagues, it is clear that the culture and mission of the FBI and DOJ has changed in a manner which runs counter to the rights and liberties of the American people. The purpose of government is to secure our natural rights. Yet the testimony we have heard and the information received from the whistleblowers and other investigative findings has shown that the FBI's mission has moved from securing those rights to using them as a predicate for investigating and surveilling the American people and weaponizing their government structure against them. Mr. Baker, in a Wall Street Journal piece you wrote titled, "The FBI Needs a Ray of Courage," you stated that in response to Attorney General Garland's memoranda directing the targeting of American parents, Director Wray should respond by highlighting that the FBI won't undertake any investigation based on speech alone. It is troubling that that statement would even need to be made. But Mr. Baker, do you think your advice was heeded by Director Wray?
In fact, I remember that episode quite clearly. I wrote that article in October, just days after the announcement became public, and I was in touch with high executives at the FBI a day or two after that. They assured me that the FBI would maintain the standard of only investigating those situations where there was violence and not investigating free speech. I have to accept the ranking members of the FBI who told me that. However, my article in the Wall Street Journal still stands. We needed the FBI needed, the American people needed to hear Director Wray say that publicly, as other FBI directors have spoke up to previous attorney generals and previous presidents, and he never did publicly. And the American people needed to hear, we wouldn't be having this discussion today if he clearly stated that we will not investigate speech, we'll only investigate violence. We're still waiting for that statement.
Okay. Mr. Turley, from what Mr. Baker just said, we have seen two issues stemming from this abuse and change of priorities within the FBI and DOJ. They are either investigating Americans based upon their constitutionally protected rights, or they are flagging lawful action to which they have political objection. In some of your recent writings, you have identified two very important points from the revelation of the FBI-Twitter relationship. First, that this relationship is a First Amendment violation as it constitutes censorship by surrogate or proxy. And second, you also are concerned that you don't know what is more menacing, the role the FBI played in Twitter's censorship program or its response to the disclosure of that role. The Constitution is a limited governance document. The First Amendment identified our God-given right to speak freely and imposes restraint that the government shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Mr. Turley, can you explain the implications of the government relying on private industry to circumvent the First Amendment?
Thank you for that question. The Supreme Court and lower courts have spent a great deal of time trying to define when a relationship with a private party can cross over to a type of agency relationship. And that also applies on the state level through the 14th Amendment. In cases like Page, for example, you have situations where you have a government official who called an employer to say, I don't like what this person said in a public meeting, and that employee was fired. And the court said, you know, that is government action. That is a violation of the First Amendment. One of the things that this subcommittee has to deal with is that difficult line, and I admit it is difficult. But in these Twitter files, there's a very disturbing picture that emerges. You have regular meetings between the FBI and Twitter. They even offered to give clearances to Twitter officials. You have complaints among Twitter employees that this is overwhelming in terms of the number. And what you really see is how insatiable censorship becomes, that eventually they were doing what appeared to be word searches and just sending all of these postings in for possible action by Twitter. And that included things like jokes and other things that anyone looking at it would realize that this is not a nefarious Russian operation. So when we talk about surrogate censorship, we're talking about one of the most serious threats against free speech. You know, people always say, well, you know, the First Amendment only applies to the government. The First Amendment is not synonymous with free speech. It deals with one problem of free speech. What we're talking about with surrogate censorship is a much greater problem for those of us who value free speech as a defining right of this country.
I appreciate that. And one more point to make, they also paid
Sorry, the
Twitter millions of
gentlelady's
dollars.
time has expired.
I will yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Wyoming, and now I recognize my friend on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Lynch, who worked successfully and diligently with our late friend Walter Jones to secure the release of 28 pages of the 9/11 document. And now I recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williams, on August 12th, 2022, the FBI and DHS released a joint intelligence bulletin warning of an increase in domestic terrorist threats against federal law enforcement officials following the search of Donald Trump's offices at Mar-a-Lago, including, quote, a threat to place a so-called dirty bomb in front of FBI headquarters and issuing general calls for civil war and armed rebellion. On August 9th, at Judiciary, GOP tweeted, the IRS is coming for you. The Department of Justice is coming for you. The FBI is coming for you. No one is safe from the political punishment in Joe Biden's America, close quote. And on that same day, my colleague, Representative Gosar, my Republican colleague, called the FBI, quote, the enemy of the people, and tweeted, we must destroy the FBI, close quote. Do you share my concerns as a former FBI employee about this type of rhetoric inflaming those who might already be inclined to do harm to our federal officers?
Mr. Lynch, above all else, I should take a moment to praise the work of the FBI and the many law enforcement agencies and individuals that I worked with throughout my time, 15 years in government, much of it in law enforcement. They do work on behalf of the American people and frankly don't sign up for threats or abuse. So to answer your question, no, absolutely, the threats hurt and are toxic and corrosive to our democracy.
Is it ever appropriate for American leaders to encourage violence against another branch of government?
The encouragement of violence is never appropriate either as a moral matter or under the law, sir.
Now, thank you. The FBI has to respond to facts on the ground. And as recently reported by the Bipartisan Center for Strategic and International Studies, 28 of the 30 domestic terrorism fatalities that occurred in 2021 were the result of far-right terrorist attacks perpetrated by individuals who were, and I'm quoting, motivated by ideas of racial or ethnic supremacy, opposition to government authority, including perceived overreach related to protocols following the COVID-19 policies, misogyny, hatred based on sexuality or gender identity, and belief in QAnon QAnon conspiracy theory or opposition to certain policies such as abortion. Mr. Williams, could a congressional investigation designed to spread misinformation suggesting that the government is a threat actually compromise the safety of American citizens?
The important words there were designed to, and so of course a congressional investigation that were designed to do that would be improper, sir.
As you've raised as well, I was on the committee when Mr. Chaffetz and our dear friend Elijah Cummings conducted those negotiations around investigations of the Secret Service, and I also agree with the former chair's instructions around our joint investigations with Walter Jones. But could congressional investigations predicated on anti-law enforcement rhetoric contribute to misinformation that could lead extremists to target government actors?
Yes, sir.
Explain that. Go into that a little bit, rather than yes or no. Someone who sat in that seat. Explain to the audience.
Sure. I think a lot of it's the climate we're in today. There is a significant risk of harm to an individual when people are whipped up by what they read and see. And so certainly these aren't mere statements. In addition to being legally actionable, they come at a significant cost, sir.
At the same time, a unilateral, this committee is based on the premise that that the American people are under attack by the federal government, by Department of Justice, by the FBI, by the Department of Homeland Security. That's the premise on which this committee was based. And I just regret the impact that that's going to have on people who might otherwise consider serving in those agencies. And I just wonder if you have a perspective on that as well.
Again, as I said briefly before, people come to, and in my experience, the vast majority of people I worked with, and frankly, if not all of them, came to serve, came to treat the rule of law as their guide and serve the American people. The fear of threats will chill people's ability, number one, to do their jobs, but also in terms of recruiting. People will not want to sign on for a job that will come necessarily with being threatened or doxxed online, sir. So I absolutely agree with that statement.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot has been said here about the fear of threats, but what we're concerned about in the scope of this committee is the fear of threats to the American citizens. The reason we use the term weaponization is because it is appropriate. We have so many examples of that across so many federal agencies that were designed to serve and protect the American people and have been used in recent years against them, that it will take us probably 2 years to lay that out. But I just want to focus on one that's been mentioned this morning because the timeline is important. The school boards issue. On June 22nd, 2021, Loudoun County parent Scott Smith spoke out at his local school board meeting and he was arrested. On September 29th, Citing Mr. Smith's arrest as an example, the National School Boards Association sent a letter to the Biden administration requesting federal law enforcement involvement in local school board disputes. Now, here's what's really important. We learned later that the White House helped the NSBA draft that letter to itself. On October 4th, Attorney General Merrick Garland issued the now infamous memo directing federal law enforcement to mobilize against the parents of school children who protest at their local school board meetings. He turned the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the full weight of the Federal Department of Justice against the very citizens they were sworn to defend and protect. On October 12th, we learned that the Loudoun County parent Scott Smith's daughter was actually sexually assaulted at her school, and that the school board covered it up, and that was the reason why that dad showed up to protest. 9 days later, October 21st, happened to be the day previously scheduled for Attorney General Merrick Garland himself to appear before our House Judiciary Committee. In that hearing, as my colleagues will remember, he was forced to acknowledge before our committee that the NSBA letter was the basis of his memo targeting concerned parents. But he refused to acknowledge the obvious chilling effect that memo, involving the full weight of the federal law enforcement apparatus, would have on parents' protected First Amendment speech. He also, by the way, refused to commit to a mandatory, under federal law, mandatory ethics review of his own family's financial ties to advancing critical race theory in schools and its relation to his school board memo and the obvious appearance of the conflict of interest therein. I encourage all interested citizens to watch the video of that hearing. It was pretty contentious. The very next day, on October 22nd, after much public outcry, the NSBA retracted and publicly apologized for its letter labeling concerned parents like Scott Smith as, quote, domestic terrorists. In the following weeks, over 20 different state school board associations severed their ties with the National School Boards Association. Our Democrat colleagues have tried to downplay the importance of this select committee and even criticized its name as hyperbolic. But as this example and so many others clearly show, key agencies have indeed been weaponized. We're informed even still today that that memo has not been retracted by the Attorney General. Here's the question, Mr. Baker. You were an FBI agent for 33 years and were involved in a lot of the important and noble work there, but you've also said clearly and been vocal about some of the egregious overreaches you've seen from the FBI and the DOJ. In recent years, you've described what has devolved into a culture of, quote, deceit and deception involving, quote, alarming FBI behavior. And you've written that those abuses threaten the liberties of those on the left as well as the right. Professor Turley just cited statistics here today that there are large numbers of Americans who now distrust the FBI. Our task here is to determine exactly how that's happened and how to correct that framework. Mr. Baker, here's the question. In your testimony, you noted that FBI Director Mueller, a couple of decades ago, worked to centralize the FBI, meaning that he centralized all information and decision-making, making that at the FBI headquarters, as opposed to his predecessor's decentralized model, which empowered the field offices instead. Do you believe the elimination of all those layers of supervision, review, and independent judgment is a key reason for all this corruption we see today, and that it's something that must be reformed and reversed? Hit that button for me, if you will.
Yes, in fact, I do, Congressman. I don't use the term corruption. The term I think is more appropriate that your colleague, Congresswoman Stefanik, used, the rotten culture, the culture rot. And specifically as regards to centralization, there's no question about it. Traditionally in the FBI, field agent had an investigation. He had a field supervisor above him. Above him was the agent in charge of that office. Only then did the information and the decision-making go to FBI headquarters. What happened under Mueller's centralized thing, all of that was eliminated. They ran these key investigations, the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and then the Trump collusion investigation, out of headquarters, eliminated all these layers of independent judgment, supervision, gone. So you had someone like somebody.
Could everybody put a 1 in the chat if you just love the infighting among the wicked? Put a 1 in the chat if you just love the infighting among the wicked.
Somebody mentioned his name already here. Strzok not only writes the communication opening the case, he goes the next day to London and conducts the first interview in the case. You have McCabe, a deputy director, number 2 in the whole bureau, directs the investigation and sends 2 agents to the White House to interview General Flynn. No levels of review. It was bound to end badly.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Yeah, they had a name for it. It's called a headquarters special. And the point is, it wasn't special so much, it became the norm. With that, the chair now recognizes.
Mr. Chairman, could I have a point of order? There have been a lot of mention of information and testimony that you all have received from whistleblowers. Well, when are you planning on providing that to the minority?
You could have been for the very first deposition, or excuse me, transcribed interview of the whistleblower. I was there when he testified on Tuesday.
Okay, that's fine. I assume you'll turn those over. But what about, you talk about dozens of whistleblowers. When are we going to get that information?
When they testify, when we work with, I'll work with the ranking member on that information.
You don't have any transcriptions of their interviews?
We have the first one, and we have the dozens who come and talk to our office.
They talk to your office privately?
Talk to Republican staff, right?
And they're not transcribed, no notes, no nothing?
The first one happened Tuesday.
No, I'm not talking about the first one.
The first one happened Tuesday, the
dozens.
next one happens tomorrow, the third one happens next Wednesday, and we'll continue to do that.
You just said dozens. Do you have notes from those, or they're just talking to you, to your staff?
Mr. Chairman, isn't that how whistleblowers typically work?
Well, it's how they're supposed to work. It's not how they worked in the impeachment that Mr. Goldman was a part of when Mr. Schiff said he didn't have contact with that whistleblower, but in fact,
Actually,
he did.
it worked
So we're
exactly
doing it the way-
appropriately until
we're doing
Mr.
it the way you're
Trump would
supposed
not
to do it.
allow.
We're doing it the way we're supposed to do it, Mr. Goldman.
No, you're supposed to turn it over to the minority.
When they come and testify, you'll have access to the transcript like everyone on the committee will.
You mean your staff is not going to turn it over to our staff? We're just in the dark?
No, when the transcript is done, you will get the transcript.
I mean, of the dozens of whistleblowers you have already talked to that came to talk to your staff.
Yeah. What do you want me to turn over there?
Did you
Their names?
notes? Anyone take notes?
I'll be happy to talk with the ranking member on how we handle that information.
Thank you.
All I'm telling you is we will schedule each for a deposition, and we are doing that. You didn't show up for the first one, but you could have been there. With that,
I didn't know about it.
The chair now recognizes. The chair now.
Cicilline was there.
There were Democrat members at the.
I think you need to work on your schedule.
The chair now recognizes, I think, Ms. Sanchez, the gentlelady from California, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know from experience how good investigations can really improve public policy. In 2009, my investigations shed light on the traumatic brain injury risks that accompany professional football, and I'm proud to say that that work changed how football teams and, more importantly, youth sports leagues address concussions. But I have also seen congressional oversight at its worst. I served on the Select Committee on Benghazi, and I saw how politicized and expensive that investigation was. And I want to note again that the final report found no new evidence of wrongdoing. Mr. Williams, you've handled oversight for both Congress and the executive branch. Based on your experience, what are the hallmarks of fair and effective congressional oversight?
Again, fair and effective oversight is number one. Does it serve to make government work and function better on behalf of the American people? And then I would say, two, is there a process of accommodation between the branches of government that are seeking to have information? And that's, so that, you know, in my case, that was the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security, but any government entity, are they working productively together? Those two things.
I'm glad you raised the issue of accommodation process. Can you explain why that's necessary and why the government can't simply comply with every congressional oversight request the moment that it's made?
Sure, and here's an example, Congressman Sanchez. It's actually more efficient in many circumstances for the parties to attempt to come to an agreement prior to whether it's issuing subpoenas or going straight to hearings and so on, because of the fact that things that are more contentious are far more likely to end up in litigation and tied up in the courts for whether it's months or years thereafter. Where if the parties had just at the beginning tried to resolve it, like the judge I clerked for used to say, "Can't y'all work this out?" We'll try to work it out up front and come to some agreement where not everybody gets what they were initially asking for, but somehow the process moves forward.
Last week, just 2 weeks after being named chairman, Mr. Jordan served multiple subpoenas seeking internal information from the executive branch. In your experience, can it sometimes take time for the accommodations process to play out?
Exactly, as I said, it can take time, but it's far more productive to end up with a more time-consuming process up front, but where everybody ends up getting what they want.
Thank you. Now, I'm not a prosecutor, but you've been a prosecutor,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
The chairman of this select committee held a press conference earlier this week to talk about various interviews that his staff is conducting. Now, I haven't been able to be in those interviews, but I want to ask you about some things that the committee should keep in mind as it moves forward with our work on this select committee. Could the fact that someone has no firsthand knowledge of the matters they're discussing impact the credibility of what they say?
Yes.
And what if they vocally advocated conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact? Should that impact how the committee views their testimony?
Yes, openly advocating conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact would have a negative impact on an open investigation.
Thank you. And now I just want to clarify some of the discussion that we've heard about parents protesting at school board meetings. People have the right to free speech in this country, but is that an absolute right?
Absolutely, and the best example is threats against other people are not, it's just not protected speech.
And in fact, many of these people who have shown up at school board meetings had threatened school board officials with violence or even with death. And isn't that the reason why they were placed on this,
Sure.
special sort of monitoring thing to make sure that they were not going to carry out those threats of violence?
To be clear, Congressman, I'm not familiar with the particulars of each individual case. I can say, however, and this is based on my experience as a prosecutor, if somebody threatened somebody else or violated the law in another way in a manner that could either, the term is probable cause, if there's probable cause to believe that an offense was committed, then certainly law enforcement can take action. And frankly, if law enforcement oversteps its bounds, there's a process through the civil rights process or any other way of dealing with that and addressing it.
So again, we have the right to free speech in this country, but it's not absolute if it includes threats against other people. And it's not just violence that we should be looking out for, but it's also threats of violence that law enforcement should be looking out for.
Absolutely, it's the threats of violence because look, to be quite straightforward, threats of violence lead to violence or can.
Great, thank you. I appreciate your testimony, and I yield back.
Lady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Mr. Williams, wouldn't the American people feel like this government wasn't so weaponized against them if there wasn't such a revolving door between Department of Justice senior officials and lobbying?
I don't quite follow the premise of your question, sir.
It's pretty easy. There's a revolving door between senior officials at the DOJ and the lobbying profession. Do you think that that gives the public more or less trust?
There are rules governing what employment, and this is based on my understanding, I've been government for 15 years, governing what post-government employment can be. One, what individuals' actions can be once they're employed elsewhere, but also what they're allowed to do.
Lobbying is influence peddling, and you are the principal at the Rabin Group, which is a lobbying firm. And I would observe the reporting of Project Veritas, where Jordan Tristan Walker, who's a director of research and development, said on a recording, one of the things we're exploring is like, why don't we just manipulate COVID ourselves? Mutate COVID via directed evolution. FISA is a revolving door for all government officials. It's pretty good for industry, to be honest. It's bad for everyone else in America. FISA is one of the clients of the lobbying firm that you're a principal of, isn't it?
I do not represent Pfizer. I do not know,
You're a principal of the Rabin Group, right?
No, that is correct. I mean,
Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the clients of the Rabin Group, which include Pfizer.
Without objection.
Not just Pfizer, but Google as well. And in response to the Twitter files, we saw a statement come from the FBI where they said correspondence between the FBI and Twitter show nothing more than examples of our traditional, long-standing, and ongoing federal government and private sector engagements. Are there such engagements between the FBI and Google?
When you say such engagements, sir, I don't quite.
Does Google engage with the FBI, Mr. Williams?
I don't work for either Google or the FBI,
Well,
sir.
I'd have to again point you to your own client list that you advertise on your own website, which includes Google. Does it surprise you that at the Rabin Group's website, Pfizer and Google are clients?
It does not surprise me, sir, no.
The Soros-funded Open Society is one of the clients as well. Does that surprise you?
Sir, I don't have our client list in front of me right now. I will, assuming that's what it says, I will take your word for it.
Yeah, I would think that maybe one of the legislative initiatives we could pursue would be to tighten this revolving door that folks at Pfizer and folks at Big Tech seem to freely acknowledge, in which you seem to be the incarnate of the revolving door. Mr. Baker and Ms. Parker, I want to assure you both that we come not to trash the FBI, but to rescue the FBI from political capture. And it seems as though that political capture was really enhanced when Robert Mueller took a lot of the authority and power away from the field offices all over our country and centralized that power Mr. Baker, do you believe that through legislation, we might be able to restore the system of office origin, where events occur, people are able to conduct investigations in the absence of the influences of Washington, D.C.?
There's no doubt Congress can be an advocate. You're doing a lot of good by having these hearings, this panel. A lot of these things, though, have to be done internally by the DOJ and the FBI. But there's absolutely a role for Congress, looking at the abuses of FISA for one, the abuses of the unmasking for another, the abuses of the indirect targeting, which actually the CIA and the NSA do rather than the FBI. But these are all things Congress can legislate solutions to.
And it seems as though those abuses become more acute the greater they have a geographic proximity to Washington, D.C. Seems we don't see these abuses with the brave FBI agents like Ms. Parker, who I'm very grateful served my fellow Floridians in the Miami field office. Ms. Parker, if we got the decision-making more out of Washington, D.C. and into the hands of our field offices where we have so many patriotic and brave FBI officials, do you think we'd be able to escape this political capture that quite literally drove you out of the Bureau?
I think that's absolutely critical at this point in our American history. When I mentioned in the opening statement, is if there are two FBIs, we in the FBI see it as the field offices, the standard rank and file. We are typically the agents who just came to the FBI to serve the country, protect American citizens, fight crime. We have no interest in politics. We really have no interest in promoting many times. And then FBI 2 is kind of more individuals that are at the headquarters level and sometimes executive roles.
It seems as though that politics isn't out in the field offices. It's here in Washington, D.C., and that's precisely what we ought to deconstruct legislatively. I thank the witnesses and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williams, do you want to take about 30 seconds to respond?
It won't even take 30 seconds, Congressman. What I would say is if we're talking today about what's within Congress's powers and duties under Article 1 of the Constitution, one such thing is legislation. If Congress wishes to pass bipartisan legislation, either about the Federal Elections Commission or lobbying requirements, have at it. That is Congress's role, and work together and do it. I would support it, and I'm sure many people in this room would.
Alas, our first bipartisan agreement.
We're in agreement there.
You're claiming my time.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Not from you. Thank you. First, I want to thank you, Ms. Parker, as a victim of the Cesar Sayoc bomb package case, along with my staff. I appreciate your service and the work that you did in the Miami Bureau. Mr. Williams, you worked in oversight for a long time, as you noted, in Congress for the executive branch. You've seen it at its best and worst. And although the Judiciary Committee has issued subpoenas over unfounded accusations just 2 weeks into this Congress, I know I have serious concerns over their rush to judgment, like many other committee actions that are employed by Republicans for purely political reasons. But their move also clearly shows that when Republicans are in charge, they use the levers of power to weaponize government. So can you tell us some examples of congressional oversight that has been abused in that way?
Well, what I will say, Congresswoman, is that when congressional oversight is abused, history doesn't treat it well. And none of us today are the judge or the guide, but history will be. And if, for instance, individuals are targeted, history will not be the judge of that if Congress is using its authorities to do so and overstep its bounds beyond the scope of its Article 1 authority.
Thank you. And what can members of Congress learn from past examples of the politicization of oversight?
I think past is prologue, and by recognizing that with a large platform as Congress has, it has the tremendous ability to harm people as much as it does to do good. And Congress ought to perhaps have that in mind when thinking about how to make government work better.
Thank you. In 2015, a member of Congress who happens to currently hold the gavel now in the House boasted that the Benghazi Select Committee was effective all because it hurt Hillary Clinton politically, saying, quote, "Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi Special Committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today?" Unquote. He even bragged in the same statement that because of it, her, quote, "numbers are dropping," unquote. During Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, Republicans held 9 investigative hearings focusing on her, including one where they called her to testify for over 11 hours. That was clearly politicized and weaponized oversight. And frankly, this weaponization committee itself epitomizes the weaponization of government. So, Mr. Williams, is it ever appropriate to turn congressional oversight authority into a weapon to harm a political opponent?
No.
And how can the politicization of congressional oversight harm the credibility of future congressional investigations?
That's exactly the point I was going to get to, Congressman. If the public loses its faith in Congress's ability to be a fair arbiter of oversight disputes, then what does Congress have ultimately? So yes, this is about the integrity of Congress, I think.
Thank you so much. Mr. Turley, turning to you, have you ever worked for Twitter?
No,
Do you have any formal relationship with the company?
no, I just have an account.
Do you have any specific or special or unique knowledge about the inner workings of Twitter?
Nothing beyond the Twitter files and what I read in the media.
So essentially, your responses to the questions here today were your own opinion and pure conjecture.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I try to base them on what we know from the Twitter files.
Well, but you said that you don't have any specific or unique knowledge of Twitter, but you spoke as if you did. You were asked very specific questions about Twitter's, the way Twitter functions and the decision-making that they make, but yet you don't have any unique or special knowledge about Twitter and have never worked for them. And so this is only just your opinion, would you say, as a Twitter account user?
No, I've come to give legal analysis based on facts that are in the public domain, and I was really referring to what I was asked about the Twitter
Reclaiming my
files.
time, legal analysis is another word for opinion.
I would think there is some distinction, but yeah, it ultimately is an opinion. But I believe the question to me was based on what the Twitter files show, and that was my reading of the Twitter files.
Right. And again, that's another way of describing your opinion being offered, which was represented as unique and special fact, which you don't possess. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Mr. Chairman, before he goes, may I be recognized for unanimous consent?
Well, I apologize. Yeah, gentleman's recognized for unanimous consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a Republican staff report from the Committee on the Judiciary dated November 4th, 2022, entitled FBI Whistleblowers, What Their Disclosures Indicate, and ask that the committee also provide a copy to Mr. Goldman so that he might be able to review all the staff notes compiled in the report.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California.
I thank the chairman. Dr. Turley, let me just go back, or Mr. Turley, let me just go back. How many times have you testified before Congress on behalf of all of us? Dozens and dozens and dozens over my 22 years.
I've testified both as a Republican and Democrat witness over 50 times, approaching 60.
So, to use a term of art, you're an expert witness when it comes to evaluating the Constitution and a great many laws and their interpretation.
That's how I've been called. That's why I've been called to this.
And you teach in that role.
I do.
Okay. And I want to thank you because in my 22 years, I have seen you representing both sides many times and normally treated with the respect that your opinions based on your readings or your scholarly work are generally respected by both sides of the aisle. And I thank you for that. You know, this committee is rightfully being talked about, subcommittee about as weaponization of government. But I just want to clear up a couple of points. The previous operation known as Operation Choke Point, where government limited people's ability actually to have bank accounts, that would be weaponization by government, a decision by government to affect commerce, correct?
Well, it certainly affects commerce. There's no question about that.
Okay, and it's outside what one would think the administrative state has a right to do in any sense. Our liberties include that right to have commerce not impinged by based on our political views by our government. So in a sense, the weaponization of DOJ isn't new, is it? It predates this administration and even the previous one.
No, that's true. Some of the darkest chapters in our history have come from the Department of Justice losing that independence and objective element that they pride themselves on. And that goes back to the Palmer raids and even before then. And whenever the DOJ and the FBI has lost its way in that sense, it has
lost its way. It's never lost its way. The way the Department of Justice operates, it's been operating that way. Our people knows this emphatically. We know this. Talking about the dark history of the DOJ, the FBI, the CIA, lost its way. It's been on the same course since its inception. If I had my way, every time they lie like this, they will bite their damn tongue.
It's come at a great cost to the country as well as the department.
Well, and speaking of lost their way, back in 2010, 2012, with the IRS's targeting of conservative groups headed by Lois Lerner, that certainly limited the free speech of those organizations when they were denied their ability to hold themselves as not-for-profits, correct?
That had serious free speech implications.
So when we look at the weaponization of government, we should not limit it to three-letter words over at DOJ, but in fact, we need to look at government broadly and how it might impinge free speech or our rights to simply have our liberties.
Look at the police officers and the FBI agents in the background. They mock us and undermine us every chance they get. As a matter of fact, during the time that George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis, you know, our people were taking knees and stuff in protests. And he mocked us and undermined us by taking a knee on one of our brothers' damn neck.
And to that extent, we've covered a lot of the FBI, and I think that's important. I'm mentioning the IRS, but behind there, I have a concern about the FBI. Ms. Parker, I've got to go to you. Is that something that you think represents the neutralism of simply being law enforcement for the FBI basically to kneel in support of Black Lives Matter?
That would not be deemed appropriate. They're wearing their official FBI ballistic vests. And although, like we've mentioned, FBI agents, I have the right to my First Amendment thoughts, but I am not at the liberty to express any of my political or social opinions while on the job. I know that in that instance, they were guarding our national institutions and that we heard that they were saying that they were trying to de-escalate the situation, but in those pictures, it appears that there are people smiling, clapping. It looked very far from de-escalation to me, but it is not appropriate to make any sort of potentially political or social statement while wearing your FBI ballistic vest on official duty. No, it is not appropriate.
In the decades I served in the Army, we were warned about when in uniform being involved in anything that appeared to pick sides. And certainly they picked a side there. I want to just close my questioning because we're going to be doing this probably for 2 years, and ask a question again, Mr. Turley. We have this question of government and what it's doing, but a lot of people are talking about how Twitter's a private company, Facebook's a private company. They're all private companies. Isn't it fair to say that from a standpoint of statutory and constitutional history,
these are not private companies? We know where they got the money to start these companies. See, that's the problem. They lie and they insult our intelligence. Now, these companies cost hundreds of millions of dollars to start and establish. Like a Mark Zuckerberg. Where did he get $300 million to start Facebook, and Tom Ford with the other one? I think it was MySpace back in the day, and then you got YouTube now. Where do they get this money from? See, our people, we don't realize that depending on what we say on these platforms, we can be indicting ourselves. It can turn into the Get Indicted hotline. And these people want us to believe that these companies are private.
history, our government has clearly looked at entities which convey free speech, newspapers, radio, television, and has limited the concentration of power and the concentration of ownership in order to maintain, although private, an ability for all, or at least most, free speech to find an avenue. Isn't that the history that we're also going to have to look at when it's concentrated in just a few companies?
It is, and the fact is that much of our political dialogue now takes a place on social media, which has replaced even telephones as a common form of communication. And that's why it is true that private companies can limit speech. But you have to keep in mind, these are communicative companies. These are closer to the AT&T than they are Starbucks. And that raises a serious question in terms of not just looking at the government aspect of coordinating and targeting citizens for possible censorship, but the control of these companies over speech. And I think that people that sort of dismiss that are really losing the fact that this is now much of what is the marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas is now a digital marketplace, and it's controlled by these companies.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm so glad my friend from California just brought up Lois Lerner and the IRS and your comment, Professor Turley, that was troubling in terms of targeting a particular point of view, because, of course, that's not true. As we learned, the Inspector General, the TIGTA, deliberately focused only on conservative filters, even though he was presented with clear evidence that the filters were nonpartisan. There were liberal filters, lefty filters, conservative filters, Republican filters, Democratic filters, but they chose because they wanted to make a case that this was deliberate censorship and targeting by the IRS. Wasn't true. Never was true. False premise. And that's what I worry about right here on this committee. The premise is the FBI is tainted. The FBI is doing dirty work. It's got the hobnail boot of government on the necks of the American people who are simply trying to express themselves. Mr. Williams, you think the insurrectionists, thousands of them, who came here, many of them armed, that led to 5 deaths and the storming of the Capitol, to try to prevent the constitutional certification of the counting of the ballots for the President of the United States on January 6, 2021. You think that was nothing more than patriots who got a little carried away and they were just expressing their First Amendment rights, and the FBI shouldn't have been looking at it and certainly shouldn't be prosecuting people for it?
Well, certainly, sir. I believe almost 1,000, if not over 1,000 people have been charged with crimes in connection with that day. Several people have now been convicted by juries and also with findings that were affirmed by federal judges of seditious conspiracy. That's using force or threats to impede or delay the execution of laws of the United States. So
I guess I hear you saying we need to make a distinction between the expression of views, which is absolutely protected under the Constitution of the United States, First Amendment, and the use of violence to propound and propagate those views.
That is correct. So the First Amendment does not protect the use of violence.
Correct. In fact, that's illegal.
Correct.
So when we talk about parents just going to school boards, trying to express their concerns, that's true. Many parents go. I was a parent with a kid in a school system. I was a card-carrying PTA member. I certainly testified now and then about the school budget or school issues, but I didn't threaten the lives or families of school board members. I didn't anonymously threaten violence or let it be known that I knew where they lived and that there'd be trouble. That's a different form of speech, isn't it?
Yes.
Would it be wrong for the FBI under some circumstances to be called in to look into that for the protection of elected school board members and, for that matter, active parents?
Both the FBI or state and local authorities who also have the ability to investigate violent crimes.
So do you think the FBI is the enemy of the American people?
I do not believe, in my experience, look, again, I was in
Do you
government
think
for 15
the
years.
FBI ought to be defunded?
I do not believe the FBI should be defunded.
So,
sir,
for
no.
example, if they were, the Tampa field office that infiltrated and spent 6 months embedded in a network of ransomware gag, Hive, and took it down. Hive is no longer functioning. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That is a very good thing. Look, I was a prosecutor and a senior executive at the Justice Department. Fighting crime is a good thing, and I think we can all agree on that.
I see. So they're not just, censoring free speech. They're actually doing some good things that protect the American people.
Yes.
Would you say that characterizes largely their mission and their function?
In my experience of working with the FBI and other federal law enforcement for years, absolutely, sir, that was my experience.
So we have to put everything in context here. We can't allow somebody who asserts they're up to no good because a particular agent or a couple of agents may be doing X, Y, and Z, ought not to taint the entire function and mission or personnel of the FBI. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, correct.
And that goes to their other missions: cybersecurity protection, human sex trafficking, breaking up those rings, and for that matter, protecting us from domestic extremists who are propounding and using violence as a weapon to further their cause.
What is special about the FBI, sir, very quickly, is that unlike many other law enforcement agencies, it has both a counterterrorism element and a law enforcement element. Now, many people may think those are all one and the same, but those are actually two different functions. And so, yes, both of those help keep the American people safe.
I thank you, and I yield back.
I think the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and to witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Turley. My condolences that you've had to sit through 60 of these, but thank you for being willing to do that. I look forward to hearing from all of you, but Mr. Chairman, I also look forward to hearing others who are key to this investigation. Christopher Wray, the Attorney General, former FBI Director Comey, former CIA Director Brennan. I hope we have a chance to hear from them as well. I want to share with you my first experience in this area. 2017, member of the House Intelligence Committee, after months and months of stonewalling, we were finally allowed to go to the FBI building and to read the FISA application on Carter Page. And after reading that application, it was very, very clear to me the FBI has lied to the FISA courts. The FBI has lied to Congress, and the FBI has lied to the American people. After that, I had a similar experience with some CIA documents and then other agencies. And the result of this is when, Mr. Turley, you talk about losing the faith of the American people. If an FBI agent called me today and said they wanted to speak with me, I would never speak to them, regardless of the topic, without my attorney present. And by the way, Congress has to reauthorize 702 this year. And we are a long way away from getting the trust of confidence because of the subject we're talking about today. And we'll lose a valuable tool if many people are simply going to say, we won't give them that authority, they abuse it. I'd like to focus on the FBI abuse if I could. I'd remind you, Carter Page was an innocent American citizen. The FBI said he was a Russian spy. Turned out that was not true. In fact, turned out there was zero evidence that he was a Russian spy. And yet the FBI IG went and looked at the FISA application, and this is what they found. And Mr. Williams, I hope you'll pay attention to this because I'm going to ask you a question about this. They found 17 significant errors or omissions. They found 51 wrong or unsupported factual assertions, including FBI lawyers who simply made up evidence and included it in the FISA application. Disgusted by this, I would suppose, the IG went and looked at random 25 other FISA applications and found significant inconsistencies and omissions in every one of them. Mr. Baker, you're a former FBI agent. Do you think that 17 omissions, 51 wrong assertions in a FISA application that, by the way, if you're going to get one right, don't you think the one that's targeting the President of the United States would be one you'd be particularly careful of? And yet they found that many omissions. Do you find that a standard acceptable?
Of course not, Congressman. And in fact, it's actually even worse than you described. There was exculpatory information available that was not considered. Some of the information that was considered, we now know from the Steele dossier was false.
That's right. And the list goes on.
But even beyond that, the fact is that individual American, that U.S. person, Carter Page, should not have been subject to that FISA surveillance because he was an individual who, this is all on the public record now, had cooperated with the CIA and the FBI in previous investigations. So he would, by the guidelines that existed then, he should have been excluded from FISA. He could have been directly interviewed.
That's right. Mr. Baker, I'm going to cut you off because
Okay.
you've made your point. Mr. Williams, do you think that, as I've described to you, 17 omissions, 51 wrong assertions in one FISA application is professionally done?
Sir, I would say that this is a matter that continues to be of interest to the Justice
It's a
Department.
simple
and I-
question. Do you find that acceptable? I think it's hilarious that you won't say, no, I don't.
What I'm saying, sir, is that this is a matter before the Justice Department and Congress that has been ongoing for years.
Okay,
and
so
should
you
correct-
won't answer the question.
What
if
I
you
will
find
say
that
is that
acceptable.
it makes sense for you to direct the question to the Justice Department.
I'm asking your opinion. I'm not asking for any insight into their investigation. I'm asking for a simple opinion. Do you find that acceptable?
What I will say, as is
Okay,
my
never mind. Do
opinion-
not answer the
I
question.
think he's answered.
Because of this, the FBI initiated reforms. And you know what they were? Trainings. Here's some trainings for senior FBI officials. Training number 1, don't lie to FISA courts. Training number 2, don't make things up. How about training number 3? Don't hide evidence. That's what senior officials in the FBI did. And if I wish I had more time, I'm almost out of time, because I would come to you and ask, first, Mr. Williams, I'd come back one more time and ask you if you find that acceptable or not, but we won't waste time with it. I would ask, how do we restore faith in the FBI? Because we want to trust the FBI. And people say you're going after the FBI. What nonsense. We're trying to protect the FBI. I know FBI agents who are deeply offended by what they see. They want us to hold them accountable, and that's what the committee is going to do. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It pays to do a lot of listening, and what I've heard is a lot of discussion about this memo. And we ought to really take a look at it. In fact, it's on the FBI website right now. You can pull it up as I talk. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter that memo into the record. Thank you. So what do we really have here? I've read the memo. I recommend we all do. It starts off in the first paragraph, making it perfectly clear that 1, the lawful First Amendment protection activity should never be subject to persecution, prosecution. That's the free speech piece right there in the very first paragraph of the memo. And 2, the actual issue of concern in this memo is the illegal violence, which has been discussed by several of you as totally illegal, or threats of violence. So let me be very, very clear here. We have myriad examples of extraordinary, serious, violent threats targeting school board officials that should be of concern to everyone in this room and all of my colleagues. Behind me are just 3 of the written examples that were of concern to the FBI. 1, quote, "It's too bad that your mama is an ugly communist whore. If she doesn't quit or resign before the end of the year, we will kill her. But first, we will kill you." It would seem to me that is a rather clear example of a violent expression of free speech, which is illegal. Also behind me is another written, this is why Hitler threw you, expletive, into the gas chamber. 3rd, we're coming after you, stinking traitors of America. This is what was out there in public school board meetings. I would love to show you the videos of those meetings, but we're not allowed to under the rules, apparently. But if we were to do that, we would have a rather clear and numerous examples of violent threats to school board members, teachers, administrators across this nation. this memo by the Attorney General, however it came to be, and that's been discussed here, that maybe somebody suggested that he take action on this, which is rather common. There's not one of us on this dais that hasn't been asked by one or more of our constituents to do something. And so the Attorney General does. He sends out a memo to the FBI agents across the country saying, bad things are going on. Maybe I should just read it. Threats against public servants are not only illegal, they run counter to our nation's core values. Those who dedicate their time and energy to ensuring that our children receive a proper education in a safe environment deserve to be able to do their work without fear for their safety. That's the memo. That's what happened here. Is it the director noting, and I'm sure he had more than one source than the School Board Association, that there were things going on in our society that were dangerous. Ms. Parker, you spoke to the difference here between free speech and violent speech. This is what the FBI director did. He said to the agents, pay attention to this and keep track of it. Why? Why did he want them to do that? Because there were threats. Very real threats. Did any of them materialize? There's evidence that they did. You take a look across this country at the number of public servants that simply decided to not serve because of the violent threats. So as we go about our work here, as we go about looking at the weaponization of the federal government, we must be careful that we don't become a weapon to be used for political purposes. There clearly, absolutely is a need to monitor all federal agencies, law enforcement, military, on and on. But let's be very careful that we don't use this committee as a weapon for political purposes.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio. It occurs to me that we're sitting here in a committee that's got a fancy name, a different name. There are people watching our very first hearing and wondering, are these folks serious? There are people who have spent their careers dedicated to the service of people in this country, working at the FBI, wondering, are these folks serious enough that I could be a whistleblower, that I could come forward and share information with them and they would actually do something with it and that something good could come from it. And I want to let those people who are watching, Ms. Parker and Mr. Baker, you're an excellent example of people who will come forward and make a difference. And I want to let those people know that I've come to this city for 10 years with one basic premise, which is this is the best country on the planet, the best country that's ever been. It's deeply flawed, but we owe it to our children to fix it. And that's why I sought to be on this committee. That's why I thank you, Mr. Baker, and you, Ms. Parker, for being here, and why I invite others who are watching to please come to us. Find somebody on this dais that you trust and tell us your story so we can fix it. And speaking of fixing things, I want to talk about the FISA program, which, Mr. Baker, you've talked about in your testimony, particularly 702 parts of it that we are going to re-examine and reauthorize potentially. On the surface of it, it sounds like a practical legal concept that you would collect information on foreign targets who don't have constitutional rights, and you might incidentally collect information that pertains to U.S. citizens who do have constitutional rights. But because it was collected incidentally and not in pursuit of that U.S. person, oh, we'll go look at this data, you know, we'll put some policies and procedures. But The Constitution does not apply here because it was incidentally collected. Well, if the incidental collection were small enough, that might be a valid concept. The problem is we've collected millions of exabytes of data. When what you're collecting incidentally becomes the entire universe, I think you might need a warrant to go look at that information. And when the number of searches that is done on U.S. persons by the FBI, I'm not talking about CIA, NSA. We know in 2020, it was over 1 million searches into this phishing, into this database where you don't need a warrant. And then in 2021, it went from 1 million to over 3 million searches. This is problematic, and I hope we look at this going forward. Mr. Baker, you mentioned something in your written testimony I don't think you got a chance to speak about here today. Can you tell us what reverse targeting is and
Yes.
why we might want to be concerned about that?
Yes, and it's not well understood, but in a nutshell, here it is. The CIA and the NSA are forbidden to target Americans, as you know. They often, and as you said, the numbers are in vast numbers where they pick up Americans most of the time just by incidental collection, and the Americans are not really doing anything wrong. If they pick up information that an American is breaking the law or is somehow a threat to national security, those other agencies, the CIA and the NSA, are supposed to provide that information to the FBI for appropriate action, and action can't be taken on it. But in reverse targeting, which John Brennan, during the Russian collusion thing, acknowledged they were doing, they would target a foreign person who was close to an American they were really interested in. And then when they picked up that information on the Americans, aha, we got it in incidental collection, which that was all phony and false. It wasn't incidental collection at all. That is another thing that you in the Congress on both sides of the aisle can address and correct. You can institute penalties for them pulling this monkey business like that.
Mr. Turley, Professor Turley, I know we don't have a lot of time, but do you think, and obviously private companies don't infringe the First Amendment until the government tells them to do it. Do you think that Section 230 gave them some comfort that if they did that, that these private companies, if they sort of, when the government suggested to do something, that they did it, that they would have a safe harbor?
Well, I do think that Section 230 is becoming increasingly untenable. It was really designed on the premise that these social media companies and other platforms were not in an editing function, that they were simply a forum, a publisher. That's clearly not the case. I mean, we obviously have an extensive censorship system here that is in place. And so the premise of 230, I think, has largely been discarded. But the implications of what has been created cannot be really overstated. We're talking about a censorship system that affects billions of people. And we also have a confirmation in the Twitter files of the United States government pinpointing people who should be censored or suspended. That should trouble people regardless of your party affiliation, whether you want the government in that business. And I think that's worthy of a debate.
I think I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Allred.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've worked hard now in my 5 years, it's going in my 5th year in this body to develop a reputation and a record of bipartisanship, of working on issues like veterans' health care and benefits, on infrastructure, on paid leave, trying to improve folks' lives. To me, this subcommittee and this hearing is a disgrace. There's nothing to do with helping Americans struggling, nothing to do with helping families like mine growing up. I was raised by a single mother. It's just been an airing of grievances, of debunked claims and conspiracy theories. I think most folks watching back home are having a hard time following some of what y'all are saying because you have to go so far down the rabbit hole. Now, before I was elected to Congress, I was a civil rights lawyer. I served as an appointed lawyer in the Obama administration. And I believe in Congress's Article I duties to conduct oversight and the executive branch's responsibilities to enforce the law and work with us. That nexus is governed by the accommodation process, which ensures that there's trust and prevents politicians from meddling in the Department of Justice and into its investigations. Now, on January 20th, the Justice Department sent a letter to the chairman saying that we share your belief that congressional oversight is vital to our functioning democracy, and we're committed to cooperating with legitimate efforts to seek information consistent with our obligation to protect executive branch confidentiality interests. They said the department's mission is to independently and impartially uphold the rule of law, requires us to maintain the integrity of our investigations, prosecutions, and civil actions, and to avoid even a perception that our efforts are being influenced by anything but the law and the facts. Despite that, the chairman of this committee has sought to seek numerous documents related to the FBI's ongoing investigations into the January 6th Capitol insurrection cases and other domestic terrorist cases, many of which are open investigations and are ongoing. Mr. Baker, just to set a tone here, do you agree that the attack on the Capitol on January 6th was an act of domestic terrorism?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Do you agree the attack on the Capitol on January 6th was an act of domestic terrorism?
I don't think I'm in a position to judge that. It was an act of lawlessness. There was a lot of property destroyed.
You're here as an expert,
and there were
sir.
crimes
You're
committed
here based on your experience.
by trespassing. I don't know if that rises to the level of terrorism, quite frankly. It might,
Well,
but I don't know
would
that.
constitute domestic terrorism to you, sir?
Domestic terrorism is acts of violence to influence political decisions. That's what we
You know
were
what
told
we
in the
do on
past.
January 6th every 4 years?
Well, January 6th to me looked like a riot.
It was a seditious
It was lawless. It
conspiracy.
was lawless. There was property destroyed. There was trespassing. There were people injured. Those are all crimes.
Thankfully, numerous courts and juries have disagreed with you and have found many of those insurrectionists guilty. It was an act of domestic terrorism, and I thank you for clarifying for all of us here that you can't decide whether it was or not. I want to go to you, Mr. Williams, because I think that we need to be very careful here. Nobody really wants members of Congress or politicians jumping into ongoing criminal investigations for many good reasons that I think you lay out in your testimony. Can you give us just a few reasons of why it would be a major problem for criminal investigations to suddenly be subject to the whim of a politician?
I'd say 3 reasons, Congressman Allred, and thank you for that question. One, as articulated in the letter by the Deputy Attorney General that was quoted by, I believe it was Congressman Harassment earlier, you do not want the public to get a roadmap for how investigations are going to play out. That involves tipping off witnesses or defendants who might be brought into the system. So that's point one. You just don't want to give the roadmap, and that's the word used by the Justice Department. Number 2, and this is a big one, the fear of influence or the appearance of influence. If a prosecution continues right after a member of Congress or someone speaks out, the public is left with the perception that Congress, in effect, had its thumb on the scale of a federal prosecution, and that's problematic. And finally, everyone is entitled to a presumption of innocence. The Justice Department takes very seriously the idea that naming or outing people who are not themselves yet criminal defendants is incredibly problematic, dangerous, in a profound manner. So
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I yield back.
I think the gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Turley, I saw the effort to discredit you by a member on the other side sort of go down in flames. I don't think much else needs to be said about that. But, you know, I think what is interesting about what you've written and then in your testimony about the Twitter files and your tentative conclusion about what they may indicate is a product. First, it bears repeating. I mean, you said there that it, quote, could well constitute the largest censorship program ever run by the government of the United States. And I think what attracts you is there is a body of evidence. It is not accusations, it is evidence that we would not have but for the voluntary, it may be extraordinarily unlikely, voluntary act of a very wealthy American who had the will and interest to purchase that company and then disclose what its files hold. Here's what's notable. We didn't get any information about what the FBI and the CIA and the ODNI and GEC and all these other agencies are engaged in from those agencies. The American people wouldn't know, but for Elon Musk's disclosures and the independent journalists who then used them. You've talked a little bit in response to earlier questions about how there might be enough evidence there, or in other evidence we might be able to get of a like kind, to suggest an agency relationship between United States government agencies, the FBI, and these social media platforms that would cross the First Amendment line and violate the rights of Americans whose content was flagged for taken down. And that may well be, but it seems to me there's another angle to this. Everybody knows in the debate over big tech that these social media platforms have content moderation policies that are narrower than the First Amendment. They take down speech as a matter of practice that the First Amendment would protect if it were a government. In fact, a lot of people say, well, they can do that, they're private businesses. The question that gets at me is this: how could the FBI, which is sworn to protect the Constitution, ever justify using intense application of its resources, agents, etc., to urge social media platforms to use those standards to take down speech that the Constitution protects?
Yeah, this goes to the sort of bifurcated issue here legally. That is, you have on one hand the question of the agency relationship, which actually some courts like the Eighth Circuit and Dawson, the Sixth Circuit and Page have had analogous cases where they said that there was an agency when a government official made a call and negative actions were taken. But there's also the direct action. Obviously, federal agents are government actors. And in these cases, you have the agency identifying American citizens and others for their viewpoints and saying, we think these people should be suspended or removed. And as I say in my testimony, it's a particularly ominous thing to have the chief law enforcement agency performing this role, an agency with incredible powers. But this wasn't the normal situation of a public affairs office where someone says, look, the FBI did this, and the public affairs office says, you know what, that was a state raid. We weren't even in that issue.
They did it in private.
Right, here you had the government itself looking for citizens who should be silenced and targeted. That's a problem in and of itself, whether it also triggers an agency relationship. Do we want to go back to the day when governments created those types of lists?
Let me get you to comment on something else that I believe is ominous. It's on the charts behind me. One of the Twitter file disclosures is that Elvis Chan at the FBI San Francisco wrote to a Twitter executive and said, my colleagues at the fort had a query for you. Turns out they had to tell me that means Fort Meade, the National Security Agency, NSA, probably. A few years ago, Twitter said they would no longer provide their data feed to members of the IC. That means intelligence community. And he goes on to ask whether colleagues at the NSA want to know if they'd reconsider that, because the NSA would like to vacuum up every word mentioned on Twitter by American citizens to be analyzed by computers to figure out what they would make of it. What about that? You don't comment on that in your column, but I'm curious what your impression is of that.
Well, that's another troubling aspect of this interstitial relationship between the government and social media companies. Now, on some occasions, the social media companies said, we're not going to do that. But all these different layers of interaction that the Twitter files refer to make it harder and harder to discern where the government ends and the social media company begins. And I want to emphasize that when I talk about the largest censorship system in history, that is really unquestionable, right? Even Twitter alone is a massive censorship system. And you combine the other companies. Now, it is privately run, and now we're looking at how much of that was being directed or influenced by the United States government. But we are, without question, talking about the world's largest censorship system. And when you add elements like the one that you talked about of this sort of interstitial relationship or cross-pollination between agencies and social media, it becomes a very menacing prospect. These companies are enormously powerful. They control much of our political speech. And as we talk about the dangers to democracy, and I agree with many of the Democratic members and the Republican members about the need to protect our democracy, that's a threat to democracy. When you have the ability of people to speak and control of companies that are using standards that are really undiscernible. Yesterday, when we heard the testimony of one of the Twitter executives, she gave a standard for which they would decide what could be censored. I wrote about it today on the blog. That standard defies definition. And I will simply say that the greatest danger of the First Amendment is the chilling effect, the unknown of when you will be targeted.
I regret my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Chairman, I just promoted you this afternoon.
Being called worse.
And it did not take 15 rounds of voting to do it. Thank
I'm going to leave right here. I went an hour, almost an hour and a half. I'm going to leave right here with this hearing. I hope it was informative, and we'll see what happens. We have to stay on top of these type of things because it's about our privacy and it's about our rights, because these agencies, we as a people, we know what they do to us. We know what they've done to our organizations and our, neutralizing our organizations and infiltrating our organizations and really making them into what they are today. Because the Bloods and the Crips were organizations. Yet when these agencies sent these agents into our communities to infiltrate and neutralize our organizations, and they are actually those of us who participate in that, and it's really not to that level today. They were fighting on those lies for a long time until they came to their senses. They were fighting on those lies. So they have done a lot of damage to our people. And then they lied and said that the COINTELPRO program, that program had ended in the 1970s, but we know that it still exists, and we know they still operate like that. So we just keep our heads on a swivel, keep our eyes open, be mindful, and be vigilant. But most of all, we have to be together. Salute to all who came through. Salute to Big Dog Philly OG. Salute to Chris Cyphers, K Paper Chase, the brother Prophet Levi, P Moses, Phenomenal Mommy, 45 Degree Discovery, Dangerous Music. Thank everybody who came through to join the brother. Salute to you all. This is The Enemy's Public. I am Brother Nasir. Like, share, subscribe. Leave a comment in the comment section. Peace.
Yo, the enemy's public, I gotta keep my eyes open. Pay attention, stop walking around like you blindfolded. This not the World Cup, but Nasir be kicking knowledge. This the type of information you can never learn in college. It's time to fight back, it's no more trying to play it cool. We got interviews, podcasts, and got the latest news. So sit back and relax, we about to get it started. Earth is a canvas, and guess who's the con artist? They brainwashing us, the system corrupted. You are now rocking with the enemy's public. You are now rocking with the enemy's public. I said you are now rocking with the enemy's public. Hey.
This is the Enemy's Public. I am Bro.Nasir, showing off the Enemy's Public merchandise that my wife made me for Father's Day. We have the Enemy's Public shorts with the TEP and the crosshairs. And we also have the Enemy's Public t-shirt with the TEP with Bro.Nasir, the Enemy's Public on the sleeve, and we have a YouTube logo on the bottom, letting people know that I'm on YouTube. And if they want to get to my channel, all they have to do is that if they have a scanner on their phone, is come and scan the barcode on their phone, and then you can go directly to my YouTube channel just by scanning the barcode on my t-shirt. That way, instead of people not being able to find my channel, they could find my channel just by scanning the barcode. It's fly. Instead of people trying to find me in the algorithm, they can find me directly just by scanning the barcode. This is the Enemy's Public. I am Bro.Nasir. Like, share, subscribe. Leave a comment in the comment section. Peace.